Good evening or afternoon for those who have joined us. I think people are going to trickle in shortly. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Tara Raghavan. I'm the president of SABA North America. And we're very excited that SABA North America's newly minted advertising, media, and entertainment section is pleased to sponsor this evening's screening of Crossroads, a documentary about the April 15th, 2021 mass shooting at a FedEx facility in Indianapolis, where over 80% of the employees are of South Asian descent and Punjabis in particular. The film, which was made for PBS, explores the aftermath of the shooting, including the catastrophic effect on the Sikh American community in Indianapolis. After the screening, we will have an excellent panel discussion on the film and discuss the legal and social ramification of this and other mass shootings in America and what we as a legal community can do to address the same. Without any delay, let's get started on discussing on watching the film. So let me share that.
Short white male wearing a hat has a machine gun currently in front of the building. We got 3 units arriving. He is outside in the parking lot. He said he's in a black Buick Rendezvous. EMS is en route. Attention all units, there is only one shooter, gunshot wound to the head. He is down.
311 to all units on FedEx.
Breaking news, there's been another deadly mass shooting in America.
At least 8 people were shot and killed in a shooting late Thursday night at a FedEx facility.
Thursday night, I get on Twitter and I just see like hashtags, clips of people saying that there was a shooting at FedEx. A lot of my family works there. I have about 30 family members that work there. And it ended up being like 12 or 13 of them were there.
We are finally seeing the faces of all 8 people who were killed Thursday night while working at FedEx here in Indy.
Among the victims, 4 members of the Sikh community.
90% of the workers at this facility are Sikh.
I started getting calls. I didn't pay any attention because you don't expect this could happen. There is no protocol for these things. I don't know what to do.
66-year-old Amarjeet Kaur Johal worked at the FedEx sorting facility to help support her family.
She was getting off her shift. We were able to find everybody except for her.
Well, my mother is not answering her phone. She's nowhere to be found. Her car is still outside in the parking lot. You could see it.
But we just didn't understand how to process what happened.
America has been my home for the past 56 years. I was one of the first Sikhs that ever landed in the city of Indianapolis. I am a proud American, and maybe one of these days you'll ask me, so KP Singh, tell me about yourself, or your family, or your turban, or your beard, or whatever. There was a huge influx of people from Punjabi and the Sikh community that began in the late 80s and 90s, and it's still continuing. And the population from a few thousand is maybe close to 10,000 people right here in the state of Indiana.
Majority of Sikhs are Punjabis moved here because they were in trucking business. You go 65 highway, you can go to Florida, you can go to Texas, you can go to Cincinnati, you can go to Ohio, you can go to Michigan, you can go to Canada. So this was the crossroads of America. While they're driving their trucks, and why not live in a place where they can have a nice house? Economically, this is a much better place.
My husband used to do real estate, and he went and got a job in Indianapolis, so we moved with him.
ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਹੁਣ ਮੈਂ FedEx 'ਚ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਦੀ ਹਾਂ. FedEx is a hub here.
ਇਹ ਅਰਾਊਂਡ 80% ਇੰਡੀਅਨ ਪੀਪਲ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਦੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਬਜ਼ੁਰਗ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਬਾਹਰ ਕਿਤੇ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ ਨਹੀਂ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਹੈਗੀ। ਬਾਕੀ ਕਈ ਬਜ਼ੁਰਗ ਨੇ ਜਾਂ ਕਈ ਸਾਡੇ ਵਰਗੀਆਂ ਲੇਡੀਜ਼ ਨੇ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਕੰਮ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਨਾ ਹੈਗਾ, ਸਿਰਫ 20 ਆਵਰ ਕਰਨੇ ਆ 25। If you work hard, you will get everything in America. Or you have a good life here. More opportunity for every single thing.
She was the glue to all of us. She helps everybody through any obstacle that they have. She liked going to work because they could speak their language, they could share food, they were always bringing in stuff for each other. So this was their second family. It's like going to work with your friends. Of course, you're going to be excited to go to work with your friends.
I guess the simplest way I could put this, if you guys ever know what a god is like, that's what my mom was like. Every time I went to the temple, Gurdwara, everything that they taught over there, like everything that they read out of the holy book, kind of just explained my mom to me, you know? That's how good she was. That's how good-hearted she was.
Officials have not yet determined why 19-year-old Brandon Scott Hull targeted the FedEx facility, but investigators say he used to work there.
Police said the gunman shot and killed himself.
The FBI revealing there were warning signs. Hull's mother reported her son to law enforcement.
Police found white supremacist websites on the gunman's computer.
He was reported by his mother a year ago. He would have been stopped according to the red flag law.
Authorities had not deemed Hull subject to Indiana's red flag law, allowing police or family members to petition a state court to temporarily remove a firearm from a person presenting a danger to others or themselves.
There was all of this evidence that would support a judge saying this person should not have a gun, but his case never even went to trial.
Ultimately, the judge determines whether a person is labeled as dangerous. We presented what we had to the prosecutor's office, and that decision from the Marion County Prosecutor's Office was not to move forward.
It did not get into court. Although we kept the gun that we seized, he was still able to go out and legally purchase other firearms.
For the Sikh community, it's not what happened, it's why it happened. When the offender is dead, unless there's some smoking gun manifesto, you're never gonna know the whole story. But what you wanna know is a general picture. Why did he target this shift? Who's working this particular shift? What is the security like? What's the workplace culture? The shooter in this case lived, 30 to 40 minutes away and had actually worked at other places and chose this place for a reason.
He used to work there. And I'm sure he knew the folks there.
Why this took place, it's a question in my mind. And I'm sure it's a question in a lot of people's mind that they want the answer for.
The Sikh community wants investigators to try and figure out the motives behind this mass shooting.
The Sikh community demands answers. We will keep pushing the authorities to keep us updated on all developments.
I didn't see a real attempt from the FBI to learn about the workplace culture itself. There was a lack of connection of all the dots that are in play. And then all of a sudden, there is a press conference.
The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, or BAU, conducted an extensive review of all available evidence and information gathered throughout this investigation. Based on this, BAU assesses that this was an act of suicidal murder, in which the shooter decided to commit suicide in a way which he believed would demonstrate his masculinity and capability while fulfilling a final desire to experience killing people. and the shooter did not appear to have been motivated by bias or a desire to advance an ideology.
When this was announced, I was there. I picked up the report that time. It says that the shooter considered other targets for an attack, but chose the FedEx location. And I stopped. I said, what this means? Why did he?
Every day we're questioning, was it because of who we are or was it just because of where we work? For people to keep telling us, no, there wasn't a bias, like it makes us feel like we're crazy, like we're making up scenarios in our head. I think all of us question if we're safe here.
When you go shooting into a building knowing that this building is full of other ethnicities, majority of the people that are going to get hit are the majority of the people that work there.
Even though they told us that there wasn't a bias, we're still going to question it.
It felt very much like there was a complete lack of transparency in what the investigation entailed, what they were looking at, who they were talking to. It didn't feel like this community was given their due in terms of respect. It just felt like dismissal.
Every day it's a new challenge, new task, and we're accepting it. We have a commandment from our gurus that stay in the highest spirit, stay in Chardhi Kala.
Chardhi Kala means absolutely passionate, positive spirit. We'll be all right as time passes, but the families have a very long haul. As a community, we are keeping ourselves as safe as we can, and we are still working very hard on this whole idea of sense of belonging.
To me, they're worth a lot because they touched my mother's feet. There was a lot of balls dropped. What we were told a week and a half after the incident was pretty much word for word what we were told at the press conference 3-4 months later. Pretty much word for word. Nothing's ever gonna bring me relief. If you lose one piece to a puzzle, that puzzle is never complete. I didn't lose a mother. I lost my guru.
ਸਾਰੇ ਲੋਕੀ ਉਵੇਂ ਹੀ ਰੂਟੀਨ 'ਚ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ। People go back to their normal life again. ਆਪਣੇ ਫੈਮਿਲੀ ਨੂੰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਪਾਲਣਾ ਹੈ, ਆਪਣੇ ਆਪ ਨੂੰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਟੇਕ ਕੇਅਰ ਕਰਨੀ ਹੈ। ਮੈਨੂੰ ਮੇਰੇ ਹਿਸਾਬ ਨਾਲ ਤਾਂ ਇਹ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਕਿਤੇ ਵੀ ਹੋ ਸਕਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ। ਸੋ ਸੇਫ ਤਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਿਤੇ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦੇ। ਲਾਈਫ ਹੈ, ਸਟਰੋਂਗ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਜੀਣੀ ਪੈਂਦੀ ਹੈ।
Thank you, everyone, for watching this very important film. We're going to get started on the panel part of this. Just a second here. I'm pleased that we can further discuss the film and discuss how we as a community can address the legal and social ramifications of mass shootings in America. But before we do that, I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists today. First up is Sarita Khurana, who's the director of Crossroads. She's an incredibly talented director, producer, and writer whose work focuses on stories from the South Asian diaspora with primarily female subjects in mind. Many of you may recognize her from her direction of the documentary series A Suitable Girl, which is an award-winning documentary that's been featured at various film festivals and can be found on Amazon Prime. Sriyanka Ray is the producer of Crossroads. She too is an award-winning journalist, producer, and storyteller based in Brooklyn, New York. Sriyanka currently works as a senior producer for Brick TV, where she covers issues of race, inequality, and the criminal justice system. Sriyanka's documentaries have earned her 10 New York Emmy nominations and have been screened at various film festivals and on U.S. public television. Next, we have Amrit Kaur Akri, who's featured in the film and is the legal director of the Sikh Coalition. As legal director, Amrit focuses on high-impact litigation and manages initiatives to protect the civil rights of all Americans in areas such as workplace discrimination, hate crimes, school bullying, racial and religious profiling, and general religious rights and policy issues. Many of you might recognize her. Amrit was the recipient of SABA North America's 2022 Public Interest Achievement Award. And finally, we have Kamal Chauhan, who is also featured in the film as a relative of one of the victims, Amarjit Kaur Johal. Kamal is not only a law student, but is the founder and president of You Meet Hope, Inc., a nonprofit that provides mental health and legal services to family violence survivors in local South Asian communities in the Midwest. Welcome to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to start this discussion today by discussing the origin of the documentary, and I'll start with Sarita. Sarita, what made you want to tell this particular story?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. When I first heard about this story, it was on the front page of the New York Times, and there was an image of a group of women mourning in the Gurdwara, and then the words, mass shooting on the front page. And, immediately my heart sank, and I had all these questions about what could have possibly happened at this FedEx facility. And, the Sikh community in the US has gone through so much since 9/11, and we were approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11. We were also approaching the 10th anniversary of Oak Creek. And so when you see something like this in the newspaper, there's an immediate visceral reaction about, is this community being targeted yet again? What's going on? Especially when you read like 80 to 90% of the workers at this FedEx facility were Punjabis, were Sikhs. So that immediately, being a storyteller whose work does focus often on the South Asian community, caught my eye. And as I tracked the story over the next week or two, it left the mainstream media very quickly. And so part of my desire to tell this story and understand what was happening is that it did leave the media so quickly, and it vanished. I had to get a subscription to local indie newspapers just to kind of hear any details. And I think that invisibility and already the lack of representation of the South Asian community and this like very, we're talking about mass shootings across this country so often, but the fact that this story and this community became invisible so quickly was one of the reasons that drove me to pursue it and really try to understand what was happening.
Makes a lot of sense. Shriyanka, how can you explain how you got involved with producing the film?
It was it was almost kind of serendipitous because Sarita and I didn't know each other, but we were introduced to each other through a mutual friend who's also South Asian. And it was at a time when I think Sarita was looking to connect with someone who's also South Asian, who can speak the language. I happened to be in between projects and was trying to branch out and figure out what story I'm looking for and what excites me. And I remember when this shooting happened, I remember reading about it, and just like everyone else, I was shocked, and especially being South Asian. My background's in journalism. I cover a lot of stories of gun violence and criminal justice in Brooklyn. So gun violence and mass shootings and the laws that surround it is pretty much like my everyday. And so when I met Sarita, we started talking, and I think we just knew that we're going to do this together. So that was the beginning. And it was, we had a very tight timeline to get the filming done, to get to Indianapolis, to make it all happen. But now when I look at the film, I'm happy with how it turned out.
Yeah, the film's incredible. While the documentary is short, it's less than 14 minutes, it's clear that all of you did a ton of interviews and kind of tried to figure out what happened with the investigation and all that. Shriyanka, how did the team decide who and what to feature in telling that story?
Well, we're all South Asian here. We're all in many ways connected as immigrants. And I think that we're all a little skeptical of outsiders who come into our communities and try to tell our own stories. And so while Sarita and I knew we wanted to tell the story, we also were very aware that we have to be respectful. We are outsiders. We need to meet people in the community, be welcomed and earn trust and be authentic. And so a big part of the process was just trying to connect with community members in Indianapolis. We actually met in person and spent quite a lot of time going to the Gurdwara, going to like local hangouts, going to the Desi shops and meeting people. And we were just there, we were open to connecting with anyone who would speak to us. And so we just sort of went with it. I mean, of course, we had a plan. We had a documentary and a film to make. But I think our intention was also very much to listen to people. And, when we were in New York trying to connect with people who are in Indianapolis, it wasn't really happening. But once we were there and once we started to meet people, Desi communities, word of mouth, we got introduced to other people. And what we realized is that a lot of people did want to share their experiences. I mean, we spoke to many more people who are actually not interviewed on camera. And we do have other interviews of people who didn't make the cut. But yeah, we spoke to a ton of people and everyone wanted to share their experiences. And I think that sort of comes across and it shows in the film as well. And then, of course, we got into the edit room. And we were like, okay, well, now we have to figure out how to do this in 14 minutes, which is always a challenge. But I think that's what it was.
Can I just add
yeah, definitely.
that also a critical part of connecting to the community for us came through the Sikh Coalition. And at the time, I had reached out to them because they were already doing on the ground work, like right after the shooting happened, to provide all kinds of services and support, including translation and mental health services, and working with the police and FBI to kind of figure out what was happening. But reaching out to them also provided us with a connection in Indy as they were doing their work. They helped introduce us to some folks on one of our first trips out there. And that's how we met Amrit, of course.
Yeah. And Amrit's featured in the film. And I'm going to get to that soon, but the title of the film is Crossroads. And there's a discussion of how Indianapolis is at the crossroads of America. And incidentally, I just passed through Indianapolis traveling back from South Carolina last week. And I think we almost stopped at the Desi Bazaar because we were right across the street getting gas. But what made you go with that particular title for this documentary?
Well, Maninder Valia, who's one of the community leaders and who's featured in the film, he actually says, you know, it's the crossroads of America, Indiana. And I think that's their state motto, or maybe it's Indianapolis's motto. But so he said it, and, you know, it was just percolating in our brains, this idea of crossroads. And you know, it kind of works on a number of levels. I mean, as mentioned in the film, a lot of the Punjabi community moved from the East and West Coast to Indianapolis through the trucking industry. So, you know, you have these images of highways, and there's a particular history of how that community developed. But even more than that, I think of Crossroads as, you know, where the community is at in this particular moment after this tragic event. And, you know, it's a questioning of where is our place. We're at a crossroads with the legal system, with where we belong, with our relationship and to this country. So it just brought up a lot of questions of like, what is happening now? What is our relationship to these things? And most importantly, like, how do we move forward from this tragic, you know, this tragic event, you know? So just being at a crossroads really seemed to fit on a number of levels.
Yeah, it fits a lot of the themes that are brought out through the film for sure. And one of those, the first thing that really struck me in the film, and it's maybe because I know Amrit and have known her for a very long time, was Amrit's statement that for the Sikh community, it's not what happened, but why it happened. And I think that's a theme throughout this film that we see a lot. Everyone's questioning, why did this happen? Amrit, in your view, beyond the very obvious, why do you believe that the Sikh community of Indianapolis, and frankly, throughout the United States, need an answer to that very question?
I mean, I think it can be encapsulated in one word, which is acknowledgement. You know, despite what many people, especially those in law enforcement, may say, bias and bigotry is always the underlying offense when you have other acts on top of that. When acts of bias are perpetrated, there are both a primary and a secondary victim, you know, and you could, in this case, for example, you have really atrocious gun violence. But when there are all these connections that provide sort of a blueprint of how bias may have been a factor, it's really important for not just the individuals who are targeted themselves, but the communities that those individuals represent. It's really important that everybody feels like there's, at a minimum, been an acknowledgement of the fact that those factors may in fact exist. And, you know, everybody wants to figure out how they can move forward from trauma like this. And I think it's really hard to do that if you don't actually have acknowledgement. So for me, the why it happened is a baseline. And, you know, at one point, Gary Johal in the movie said that the law enforcement told the families of the shooting victims the same thing within 48 hours and then 3 or 4 months later. And he's right on the nail with that. And I think what that really shows is a lack of acknowledgement, because there should have been a lot of legwork in that time. And to come back with the same answers, which are no answers, I think that was pretty devastating for a lot of not just the Indianapolis community, not just the families of the individual victims, but for the Sikh community worldwide. Really, everybody wanted to know that there was an attempt at that level of acknowledgement.
Yeah, and that's something interesting. I remember reading some of the kind of the articles when the shooting first happened, and a lot of the facts were kind of laid out early on. And then those same facts were repeated in kind of the later point, and then it's the conclusion that was reached. And there's no additional facts other than what was earlier, like very early gathered, that were further considered, or it seemed like that for me. And I think I come from a different perspective, maybe because I'm a lawyer and I'm just, you know, and I'm also skeptical overall. So that may be the reason, and we'll get into that a little bit. But Komal, you lost a really dear relative and a number of other members of the community in the shooting. Do you think the community has ever gotten a satisfactory answer?
Not at all, not even close. Like everybody has stated, we still feel like we're invisible. A lot of us posed many questions. We reached out to authorities and no questions were answered. We were in the same position, like nothing had changed at all. I think like Amrita said, a lot of legwork was supposed to be done, but it just seems like they didn't do anything at all. And it really made us question why they didn't do anything. And we feel like it's because we're disposable. Our concerns did not matter to them at all. And I don't know if we will ever get a satisfactory answer, because the laws in Indiana have just been becoming looser and looser. These gun laws are looser and looser, which just goes on to show us that they still don't care. They're going to continue to not care. The only time that they show any type of interest is when the cameras are on. And that is always a trend that we see with mass shootings.
I guess, you know, coming from a slightly different perspective, if the answer was that bias was involved, would that answer even be satisfactory? I mean, just posing that to the group in general, like I'm assuming for the community, like either answer would be unpleasant and would be very hard to take.
I think when there's an understanding that a full investigation reviewing all potential factors was had, and there is some level of determination made based on a full and transparent investigation, even if we don't want to hear that somebody targeted our community just because of our religious identity or our ethnic identity, even if we don't want to hear it, the fact that we now have like a baseline from which we can try and heal, we can acknowledge what happened and why it happened, and now we move forward and we can try and heal from that, is far and away better than there being zero acknowledgement, total dismissal, and like almost said, feelings of complete invisibility that make you feel like you don't matter, the people that look like you don't matter, and any one of you could be targeted again and it won't matter.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, at least then you can address the point, right? Take safety precautions in places where there will be, like, you think you might have some bias associated with it.
Yeah, and from the legal perspective, that's also a jumping off point in terms of what are policies and laws that we can now advocate for, knowing that there's, you know, this type of act and the potential for a pattern of these types of acts moving forward. And without that level of understanding, acknowledgement, or information, you don't have a leg to stand on. It makes it very difficult, especially in a place like Indiana, where the laws are certainly not geared towards protecting people from gun violence.
In the end, the film notes that FedEx, Marion County Prosecutor's Office, and FBI did not respond to a request for an interview. Sarita or Sriyanka, have any of these organizations since the film has come out offered a response?
I don't think any of them offered a response, but we did finally get access to some photos of the crime scene through the FBI. That's right.
No, not yeah.
The prosecutor's office. Yeah, the
Through
prosecutor's office. But that was it. Like, you know, this was maybe even a month and a half ago that we finally got access to some of the photos. But no, we haven't heard from anyone representing those organizations otherwise.
I just want to like delve into that just a slight bit. And I want to talk about the investigation as well. But from the perspective of our community, what does the fact that like law enforcement and prosecutors' offices and FedEx does not have a response tell us? You know, that's disturbing, at least to me, that there is not an acknowledgement. And I know that that's what Amrit said in the first place. But I guess, you know, if we're getting this, then other communities, you know, minority communities are dealing with probably the same or worse. So, you know, is there a lesson we can learn from the film that could address that?
I also just wanted to jump in and say, I mean, it's not anything unusual, right? Like whichever part, like you can be a journalist in New York City. I reach out to the NYPD constantly and get no response. It's so much easier for bigger entities to just stay silent and let the issues sort of get brushed away under the carpet. And you know, to add to what Sarita said, we reached out to all of the various agencies, and we did get a response from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department, and they did speak to us. And we had filed a FOIL request, a Freedom of Information Act request, asking for access to a lot of the police evidence. But again, we only got access to all of that evidence, the photographs, just maybe a month or two ago. So by that time, the film was already out. So it wasn't for lack of trying. And I believe we reached out to FedEx at least 2 or 3 times. But it is upsetting, right? As a community, I think even when we were on the ground in Indianapolis, people asked us, are you in conversation with FedEx? Have they spoken to you? Has the FBI spoken to you? And we didn't get an answer. And I think the community does want to hear from these people, and they do want to know what was the reason behind it. But even in the film, we didn't get a response.
I mean, from what we heard from the folks that actually work at FedEx, we did talk to quite a few survivors and people who work there. You know, there was a very mixed response of how FedEx responded to them. You know, so there was, you know, they shut down the facility for a while, and from what I understand, within days, they changed the outdoor security system. You know, there wasn't a gate there before. There wasn't, you know, one of those turnstile type gates before. You didn't have to swipe your ID, which is why the shooter was basically able to walk into the building very easily. You know, and they provided their version of, you know, support for their employees. But I know Komal can talk a lot about this, and Amrit too, but in terms of what they didn't provide, you know, what was missing in terms of like literature being written in Punjabi. If most of your workers are Punjabi, many of whom are immigrant, or English is not their first language, there was no literature in Punjabi. They weren't letting them know about workers' compensation stuff, you know, so the response was pretty subpar in terms of, you know, how the FedEx responded to the community. So, you know, for us, you know, we wanted to really hear from FedEx about, you rarely hear about South Asian communities in the Midwest, and then you have this whole community who's supporting this major corporation and being their primary workforce, and what is their response to what happened in their facility on a real human level? That's what we were really interested in hearing, and I'm sure for them to admit to any of the security issues, which people told us about informally, this is not something we featured in the film, but we heard a lot, like, why was the shooter allowed to roam around the whole building for minutes and go in and check it out and come out and then decide to go get his guns from the trunk of his car? Who were those security people? People felt like the security at the FedEx facility was there to watch them, to make sure they didn't take packages or steal anything, not to protect them from something like this. So, I think that's what people want to hear, like, how do you respond to those kinds of things? So there's a real lack of response. And I think that's really what gets people. I mean, to be fair to, people like Amarjit Johal, who's featured in the film, they also founded a place that they really loved to work there. There are many other Punjabis there, so there was a sense of community, and there was a sense of, feeling very comfortable at one level in your workspace. But in the aftermath of all of this, there were a lot of unanswered questions that we tried to ask and did not hear about.
Yeah, one of the questions in the Q&A is, Sarita, did you find any prosecutors willing to talk about hate crimes? They need police reports, something from witnesses that puts down the ethnicity, religion, race, etc. of the victims. Without that many filings of, and this is hard to read, of hate crimes fail at trial or in plea bargains because juries won't convict for that additional charge or enhancement. It may be that we need to have hotlines in other languages to encourage reporting of hate language along with these incidents to get these charges filed in the future. And that's a really good question. I guess, I'll pose that to everyone. Maybe Amrit, you might have an answer to that. Is that something the Sikh Coalition is working on?
In terms of, well, Tara, as you know, I am a former prosecutor. I was a prosecutor for over 11 years in Chicago, so I have a lot of professional background and understanding in what it takes to actually bring hate crime and many other charges, and what that actually looks like in terms of the investigatory stage, the litigation, and the impact on victims and so on. And yes, the attendee is right. The police reports need to have some sort of evidentiary basis for a prosecutor to move forward. I mean, obviously, in this case, the shooter was dead. There was never going to be a prosecution that takes place. But I think even if that wasn't the case, it would have been really nice for there to be a more cohesive police report. And, like Sarita and Shriyanka, we also FOIA'd all of the investigative reports, both from the 2021 incidents and from the shooter's arrest in March of 2020. And so we, using those, were able to paint somewhat of a picture. I'll be honest with you, the responses to the FOIA requests were very sparse, which is another thing that really concerns me about the lack of a real, true, thorough investigation here. But just from all of our own digging, into everything that was going into this community, into prior dealings with FedEx, the shooter's background, and his engagement in certain essentially like racist meme Facebook groups and social media platforms and that kind of thing. Those are all the kinds of things that need to, at a minimum, be investigated. And I think the biggest issue here is that it's not so much that the police weren't willing to call it a hate crime. It's that they were willing to say it is not a hate crime with such absolute certainty when we all know that you can't do that? You don't have the shooter here to say, no, I had X, Y, and Z reason only. You can't also believe that people do things in mutually exclusive ways. He may well have wanted to kill people and kill himself, but he did it in this place, knowing who worked there and what that workplace culture was like, right? There's all these factors and all these dots. I talk about it in the documentary that just, it was like so blatant. And the law enforcement agencies almost intentionally refused to acknowledge any of it. And, you know, a lot of that has to do with pointing the finger, making sure that they're not the ones that are going to be at fault in any case. And it just felt like everybody was shying away from what the responsibilities were. In terms of the hotlines, I think that's a great idea. One of the biggest hurdles that we had in this case in particular was finding mental health specialists for this community, many of which are LEP, and you know, they're not proficient in English. They're primarily Punjabi speakers. And we still represent families of survivors and families of victims to this day. And we're still always looking for that type of assistance for them. And it's not like this happened in April of 2021 and we just need to put a Band-Aid on it and things get fixed. This is trauma that will impact these people and this community for generations. And so when we're talking about dealing with the potential bias factors at play here, or we're dealing with all the ways that we need to meet the needs of this community, we're not just talking about it for right now or next year, we're talking about it for the long haul, because that's the only way this community is going to be able to survive moving forward.
Yeah, and I think that gets to my next, discussion. Like, one of the things that didn't add up for me was the FBI admitted that only the shooter would know the true motivations. But the FBI also concluded that Hull did not appear to have been motivated by bias or desire to advance any ideology. So I can't reconcile those two conclusions. That doesn't make sense to me. And I think that goes to, you explicitly state, Amrit, that there was a complete lack of transparency in the investigation. And, some of the things that came out from the investigation is that this gentleman was frequenting white supremacist literature or websites. And that, I just don't understand how that could be like part of the investigation's results, but then like the conclusion is so very abrupt. I guess that's where I'm seeing the like some sort of misstep here. And
well, what's funny is when we try to go back and review all of the details of specific to the white supremacist content, digital content on the shooter's phone and laptops and so on, which has been documented in police reports. Okay, so we know that it existed at some point. We were told for over a year that actually somebody documented the fact that it existed, but then nobody took pictures of it. Nobody printed it out. Nobody created a record of what that content may or may not have included, which we later found out was not true. We did get some of that content, but then the FBI told us that they either lost or just didn't create a report on all of that. And for anyone that's ever engaged with the FBI, that is the most asinine thing that anybody's ever said, because if there's one thing the FBI does, it's cross their T's and dot their I's. They will document, right? So there were various layers of things not adding up. And that sort of built up this lack of transparency. And beyond that, we knew that there was a plethora of information because within 48 hours of the attack, actually within 24 hours, the Sikh Coalition was on the ground. Within 48 hours, we'd gathered a ton of information from survivors, witnesses, and family members of victims. And in an effort to, work with the local law enforcement agencies, we presented these individuals to the local police and to the FBI so that they could get these firsthand accounts of what had happened. And we sat there and listened as well. And so we knew all the information that they had. And it was like they were just dismissing, all sort of the back and forth about what was happening within the workplace. There was a culture within the workplace where there was some divisiveness between the Punjabi community and the non-Punjabi community. People were competitive about who gets to work what hours and who's getting paid more and, those kinds of things. And we started to put this picture together, and it just, at every turn, it felt like, as much as we wanted to give the law enforcement agencies the benefit of the doubt, they were not connecting the dots. They were not taking this information and treating it fairly or seriously. And clearly by the end of it, they didn't incorporate any of that into their final assessment, because what we got in our FOIA request is to what led to their final decision and determination that even though they don't know why he did it, they know bias wasn't a factor, doesn't take into account any of the mounds of information that we gave them.
Yeah, one of the questions in the chat is, do you agree, and I guess this is directed to Amrit, but anyone can answer it, the Yuba City incident with Roboclair may be similar to this FedEx result. How do you get the DA to do anything in the future? And I think that gets to a point that I was questioning, like, how can we as a legal community ensure that there's more transparency in these investigations?
Well, I think a big part of it, I could rattle off several other similar cases where we have, acts of bias and bigotry. I mean, Rubel is an active client of mine, so I can't go into much detail there. But I think what we've put out publicly is that in his case, it's the police department itself that did engage in some inappropriate activities. And so here, what we have in FedEx is we have what I believe is law enforcement that are just failing to act. They're not necessarily overtly engaging in inappropriate or illegal or violative activity. So I want to make that clear. But I think one of the main ways to do this is really to hold your elected officials accountable. So for example, in Yuba City in Sutter County, the DA that we reached out to after the law enforcement agency did seek charges, bias motivated charges on behalf of our client Rubel, the DA refused to even review those charges. Well, that DA lost her election, and that happened over the course of several months, during which we made a stink about what this DA was doing. Now, we're a 501c3. We don't engage in political processes. What we engage in is holding our elected officials accountable. And I think that this is not the first time somebody who's failed our community has been thrown out of office and their opponents elected. And I think that when we see the South Asian community rise up and, show the voice that we have, it really does help, and it moves the needle forward in bringing people into positions of authority that are willing to hear our voices.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now I'm going to turn to the issue of the red label or red flag law. During the investigation and in the film, it's confirmed that approximately a year prior to the shooting, Hull's mother contacted Indianapolis police, noting that he may commit suicide. And in response to that alert, the police confiscated a gun and took Hull into custody from his home. But Hull was later released and was legally able to purchase the 2 AR-15 rifles that were ultimately used in the shooting. Cole, you previously commented that there was a failure in applying the red flag law under this circumstance. And can you explain what that failure was here?
Lack of accountability. I think it really like, we didn't understand why they didn't take his own family seriously. I think for a mother to come forward and be like, hey, I think my son is a harm to himself and others, it should have been taken much more seriously. But it wasn't. And that does seem like it's a trend. I don't think that, I think the purpose behind red flag laws is great, but there's like a lack of implementation. I don't know if the lack of implementation is because there isn't open conversations between different law enforcement officials. Like, we're not sure where that gap is, but as common citizens, it's really not our job to have a complete understanding of these laws, because the people that are supposed to understand them, supposed to be upholding them, don't really seem to have an interest in the law at all. And as I stated earlier, Indiana has went in the complete opposite direction that we thought they would. When the 1-year anniversary came this year, the laws were loosened, I think within 2 weeks of that. And it almost felt like it was like a slap in the face. So I'm not sure what they expect us to do. I know that they revised the red flag law, but even with that revision, if they're just choosing to not apply it, because that's what it seems like, they're picking and choosing when they want to apply it. It doesn't really matter that it's there, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I know that there's been a number of discussions, and I've read a couple of articles. I think there's 19 states in Washington, D.C., and one of those states is Indiana that has red flag laws in place. And there's now federal legislation incentivizing the use of these red flag laws. So there's some sort of support on both sides of like the political spectrum for the use of these red flag laws. But there's also there seems to be a lack of training and understanding, even from officials that should know this, about the red flag laws. And I guess from what can we as a legal community take to help educate, I guess, not just community members, because they're not responsible for that. Well, I agree with that, but the people that need to apply these red flag laws, to educate them. Is there something we can do as a community to kind of help with that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, Tara, I think that's a great question. And secondly, I think there's a lot of things we can do about it. First, I think one of the failures in this case, because it appears that ultimately the IMPD did try and present some level of evidence to the Marion County Prosecutor's Office, and then they declined to bring that evidence before a court and have a judge rule on whether Brandon Scott Holes should be prohibited from maintaining firearms for, I think it's like a 90-day period, right? And then it goes up for another review by the court, and they determine if he still needs to be prohibited. There's really no set criteria in what law enforcement agencies need to bring to the table when they're going to a prosecutor's office, right? So we can blame the Marion County DA's office for many failures, especially in relation to the red flag law. We actually don't know what the IMPD even brought to the table. Having been a former prosecutor, if a police officer came to me and said, this person was taken into custody after a domestic violence incident, I found a gun or two, magazines, bullets, and white supremacist content, which case law says is it does give the impression that violence could be afoot. That's potentially sufficient, and as a prosecutor, I would think that I could bring that to a court and have a court make a determination based on that. We don't actually know what IMPD did here. We don't know what information they brought to the table. We don't know why the Marion County District Attorney's Office declined. They don't want to talk about it. They have prosecutorial immunity, so they could talk about it and not face any retribution, which is a whole nother issue. But they just refuse to talk about it in general and give us any sort of explanation. I think that it's really important for us to have some defined criteria, and it's important for the legal community to be aware of the fact that that doesn't currently exist. I think it's also really important to understand that many states have loopholes to properly understanding who can be flagged in terms of red flag laws. When you're bringing the whole package of information to the DA's office in order for them to make an assessment on whether they're going to bring this to a court and before a judge. That has to include any sort of background on the offender. In this case, in 2020, he, I can't remember what his birthday was, but, you know, he had juvenile history at that point. So whether he was an adult or not in 2020, he was like on the cusp. I think he was 17 or 18. You know, many states don't allow your juvenile history to be included in that. I think for, you know, for some people that's relevant and important in making those types of very serious determinations. There's also a lot of loopholes in place in terms of the way guns can be purchased and the way they can cross borders and the way you can even determine the legitimacy of somebody's ownership. And obviously that changes from state to state. And so there's really no opportunity for there to be a one size fits all criteria. And then, you know, when it's left up to the states, as a legal community, I think it's incumbent on us to really hold our states accountable and make sure that they're serving us in terms of, are the laws on the books, and especially red flag laws, are they actually protecting us? Are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? And are we managing the loopholes so that people don't slip through these cracks like the shooter in this case did?
Well, at the end of the film, there's a note that after the FedEx shooting, the IMPD no longer sends the red flag cases to Marion County prosecutor's office, but rather these cases go directly to the court. Does that really address the problem?
No, because the court's in the same position that the DA's office is in reviewing the evidence. If the police department doesn't actually have standard criteria that they know they need to be presenting to the court, and you know, it's never going to be like a one size fits all scenario, but there are some baselines. They're not going to be able to present an adequate case. And even if they had standard criteria, if these departments aren't culturally competent, you know, if we have a bunch of police officers that look at like racist, white supremacist digital content and say, I don't see what's wrong with that, that's not racist, they're not even going to know to bring that to the table, right? So there's no consistency in training for law enforcement agencies at any level, even within individual states, let alone across the country. And so I don't think that solves the problem. What we have is still a complete lack of cultural competence at a baseline for these agencies to even make sure they're, you know, crossing off all the boxes and getting all the right information before the court to make a decision.
Kulvinder Singh in the Q&A writes, if Sarita is looking to use the documentary as a teaching tool, another 5 to 10 minutes on how to report hate crimes and why to do so to the law enforcement at the scene would be proof of hate crimes for prosecutors and what would be adequate. Also, it could be offered online fully in Punjabi for that audience to find. Is this something that, you know, I don't know if Sarita needs to do it, but is this something that our legal community should consider doing? Like offering an explanation on how to report hate crimes and why to do so, and getting people to translate this so people in gurudwaras and temples and in mosques can adequately address these issues. They may not know how to report it. They may not know what to do. I think that's actually a really good idea.
Yeah, I mean, the Sikh Coalition is doing it. This is what we do
I know
on a
you are.
daily basis. Literally my job. And actually, we are working on a law enforcement guide to understanding, to bringing about cultural competence and understanding hate crimes, especially against the South Asian community. I think it's really important. And sadly, because it's a proactive resource, it's also the one thing that falls off my list every week when there are fires to be put out. But I will say it is about 90% done, and we do hope to get that out, you know, as quickly as possible. But Sarita, I think you're in a really good spot too, right, to bring that information to the forefront.
Yeah, I actually, those are both great ideas in terms of translating the documentary and also making a guide. Or, I mean, I wish we had 5-10 more minutes to tell more of the story and include, information like this. But I think it is really important for us to use the film as, a social impact tool where we can talk about stuff like that, and this discussion is part of raising awareness and kind of figuring out what can be done proactively in response to situations like this. So I think the work the Sikh Coalition is doing, and then just trying to have additional screenings where we can talk about this stuff and raise awareness and have that kind of impact is definitely something we're interested in.
I was also going to say, right, no, actually, Komal, I was going to talk about low-key and some of the work that you and, other young people are doing on the ground.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to talk about. During our healing process, a lot of youth started stepping up to the plate and they started taking on that responsibility. I think for a long time, we really have that thought of, we have to be resilient, we have to stay strong. And we were, ignoring a lot of the stuff that we were going through. But since the shooting, we've really been having open conversations with elders, and we have actually screened the movie for people and we translated it for them, and to really just help them understand that they don't have to deal with things alone. After the FedEx mass shooting, I know it was brought up before, a lot of people went back to work because they felt like they didn't have a choice. But they did have a choice. The issue is that they were needed to work, right? So a lot of people went back to work and they were struggling. And we started seeing a lot of people reaching out to us for mental health resources. And I think all of us can agree that is not a normal thing with the elder population. So, a lot of these efforts that we're talking about, they're grassroots efforts. It's our responsibility to step up to the plate and really take up space. And that's the only way we're going to hold other people accountable and actually push for long-term change.
And it starts on such a small way, as you said. I mean, growing up as the daughter of, South Asian immigrants, it's so seeped in our culture to be strong and to just let it go. It's such a cultural thing. So, the last part of the film always gets me where one of the FedEx employees, she says that, we have to still provide for the family. We have to go back to work. We have to do what we have to do. And she says, it's life. You have to be strong and you have to live it. And when we were in Indianapolis, Sarita and I were speaking to so many different types of people, including current and former FedEx employees. And there was that generational gap. And that's not just something that exists in Indianapolis. It's something that exists in our communities all over. I'm from Calcutta, I'm Bengali, I'm from India. And that exists in my community. And so I have to have these conversations with my parents and with my uncles and my aunties, saying that, no, we don't always have to be strong. We can talk about our feelings. And sometimes healing just starts on that very basic level. And maybe that's exactly where we start. I mean, we can talk about big policy changes. We can do know your rights workshops. We would want elderly people to come and learn their rights, right? But then on a human level, I think it just starts from being able to sort of talk about trauma, which is something that's so internalized in our communities, and especially generationally. I don't think we do talk about trauma in South Asian culture.
That's something that is interesting. Both Kamal and Shriyanka brought this up, that there's a theme of resilience, right? The community can survive. They can take this on. One of, I think her name was Kuldeep. I'm not sure, and I apologize. People go back to their normal life again. That's just things that people do. But are they really going back to normal life? Is there ever going to be a normal life after an incident like this? I guess for me, even if I wasn't in that FedEx facility, I don't think life is normal anymore. There is no such thing. If that's the norm, that's a problem. So ultimately, that's something we need to bring out as a legal community, that no, this is not acceptable. You can't just return back to the office when someone gets murdered. Like, that's just not cool. So something that, you know, from the perspective, you know, of Sarita and Sriyanka, like a discussion of resilience in the film, like there's some sort of like, hey, there's like a glimmer of hope. But in that hope, there's also some disturbances. Is that something that you wanted to explore in the film? Because that was clear from what I saw, but you know, I want your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ambiguity, you know, we leave viewers with at the end of the film is very intentional, you know, because it can be wrapped up through an investigation, but as you know, Komal and Sriyanka have been saying, like, and Amrit, you know, the trauma is not wrapped up in like an easy package, you know, and so I think we do want people to really question, you know, where this leaves us as a community, you know, relationship to the law and the police and the investigation. Like, it's not a closed book. Like this will linger and it will go on for a while. And that is what we want people to think about.
Yeah, I mean, Komal, you state in the film that, you know, all of us question if we are safe here. And another speaker says you're not safe anywhere. And admittedly, seeing all these mass shootings certainly makes me question whether I'm safe anywhere. I clearly look Indian, I've got a dot. You know, what steps can we as a legal community take to make our community members feel safer? And I'm just going to pose that to the group in general.
I think having those uncomfortable conversations, I think so often, like as a younger person, I never felt safe. Like I never felt like I had a safe place to have open conversations, which is why I avoided having them for such a long time. But I've now come to the point where I have to take up space. I think, like we were talking about earlier, that resiliency, it's like drilled into us, but that's not getting us anywhere, right? Because I don't even know what number mass shooting this was and how many occurred after that, how many we've seen this year, and the cycle just continues. I wish there was like a game plan or like a long-term game plan that we could have. But I think a lot of the work that we need to do is on a grassroots level. I think people can come out, like Sikh Coalition came out, they helped so much, they provided so much direction, but at the end of the day, community is only going to be open to their own community, trying to help them, right? So we have to step up to the plate. There's just been a huge gap. And I think with Indiana, everybody is so spread apart and everybody's so in tune with their differences. We all need to realize that the things that we're fighting for, like we're all fighting for the same thing. We're all fighting for safety. We're all fighting for, you know, justice, the justice that we may not get. Like, I don't think that we receive justice in this case at all. But I think just trying to build, you know, that network, that community, that legal network, because I think that is what's lacking. In the mental health resources, I think a lot of people don't go into that field. I think that's pretty common, but just connecting with people. I think we're so kind of in our own circles and we really need to just come together.
I also find that, you know, as immigrants, as people in a different country, there's a general fear of taking up space, speaking out, being loud, especially when you're, you know, there's a generational gap, and when you're a little bit older and you don't really speak the language, there's a lot of insecurity that goes with it. I think a diversity of stories is really important. And, you know, I hope that this film sheds light, because it's not just about the FedEx mass shooting. And I think Sarita and I were really clear about the fact that we're not making an investigative film, you know, investigating what happened. It's really to sort of represent and show this very resilient and active community in the Midwest. And for me, I didn't know about the Sikh community in Indiana. I only learned like when I came to the project. And in the same way, I mean, we hear about Indians who are like CEOs of companies, right? And there's like Bollywood representation and there's Priyanka Chopra, but there needs to be more stories and representation of our real communities. And whether it's, through a film like what Sarita and I did, whether it's through music, whether it's through writing, whether it's through like Know Your Rights workshops, I think it's really crucial to try to represent all the many varied voices and not just CEOs and billionaires.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We try to do that at SABA North America, but not always successful. So there's always a goal to make things better. But I think you hit up on a point, Sriyanka, that, and it's been discussed throughout this evening, is the sense of belonging. Like incidents like this really trouble the community, and from feeling that sense of belonging. And obviously we look different than the majority. I'm assuming it's even more difficult in Indiana than it is in Chicago, where obviously we have a more mixed community overall. But how do we cultivate, like, how do we address that problem that's been created in this particular incident and in other incidents across North America, where these incidences make us question whether we belong here? Like, that happens regularly at this point. So what can we as like a community, and what can we as a legal community do to address that kind of like elephant in the room?
I think we all have a platform. Sharanka was talking about celebrities, but I think at a local level, many of us are leaders within our fields, within our communities, and our networks. And so we have a platform, and we shouldn't be afraid to use it. We shouldn't be afraid to talk about, to Komal's point, these really uncomfortable conversations where we are acknowledging that there's bias out there. We don't live in a colorblind society, frankly, nor do we want to. We're not here in America to assimilate. We are here to integrate. And I think that's a real distinction that all of us need to embrace, because when you assimilate, you become just like everybody else. When you integrate, that culture embraces you. And that's what we want to be doing. And we want to use our platforms as leaders in our fields to go ahead and make that clear. And I think there's a real, we talk about generational differences. My parents' generation, as active as they are, in the community, they would never report a hate crime. I know for a fact that my parents' house has been vandalized. When I was a child growing up, our garage would get egged. They never reported it. Never. I would report that. And I think it starts with people like us who are willing to take those steps, right? Because those baby steps become really essential, and you build on those and you build on those until you get to a point where our community has a bigger, larger platform and we can really advocate for ourselves.
And any other thoughts? I want to make sure we're coming up on that 1 hour point. And I want to make sure that we get last thoughts from each of you on kind of, having seen the movie, and obviously you've all lived the movie. You're in it, you've produced it, you've directed it. For us who are outsiders, what should we take away and do, from our, I guess, leadership positions that Amrit was just talking about? And maybe I'll start with Sarita.
For me, I'll kind of circle back to where I started, which is, the intention behind the film and really wanting to make this story visible. I don't know how many of us would be sitting here talking about this right now. Like this wouldn't have been an ongoing story. It would have gotten lost. So for me, it's, yes, let's use whatever positions we do have, whether it's as filmmakers, lawyers, mental health workers, to talk about our community, to make these stories, you know, and communities visible, to really have those kinds of real conversations about where, you know, our place here, you know, in the US and what that looks like. And yeah, there's still some very, very serious discrimination and bias that our communities face. And so, yeah, for me, what I can do is try to continue telling these stories and having them be part of the conversation. You know, we're part of the conversation of gun violence and mass shootings now, and we should be, and we need to remind people that this happened in Indianapolis and who was affected and what the outcomes were, you know, and that this community wasn't given their due, and that has larger implications for the rest of the South Asian community here. So, you know, let's keep talking and talking about these things and making these things visible.
Sriyanka?
You know, this was obviously a difficult film to make. It's personal. Sarita and I are South Asian, and we felt it and we were in it. And when we were, you know, talking with victims and victims' families, it was really difficult. But I think what does come across in the last part of the film, as you said, like resilience, and what we also experienced was just how warm and welcoming this community is. These were like difficult days, difficult conversations, but we were welcomed into every home. And of course, like after filming, everyone was like feeding us, like giving us home cooked desi food, and we were drinking chai at the Gurudwara. Everyone was like, here, just take like boxes of food. Our crew was welcomed. You know, there's so much joy also. And I think that's so beautiful. And, you know, just like everyone, just as a last thought, I think that it's another thing to also remind ourselves that, yes, we are often, you know, unheard, and we don't always like know our rights. And a lot of people have opinions, but I think it's also important for us to like hold on to our joy and to show that, and, you know, collectively find healing through that. And I think the community in Indianapolis has experienced this horrible tragedy, and yet they still have it in them to welcome us, to feed us, you know, to pray and to hope and just be really good people.
Yeah. Mama?
I would just say, like, give people their power back by giving a voice to the vulnerable population. I think a lot of people have brought up that our elders may not speak English, our parents may not be able to tell people what their concerns are and what they need. That really falls on us. So I think the best thing we can do is really empower the people around you, empower the vulnerable population. And that's what I hope all of us take away from this.
Thank you. And Amrit?
What I find really interesting, probably on a frequent basis with, you know, representing the South Asian community in my legal work, is I think often we're harder on ourselves. You know, in creating that level of allyship and solidarity amongst South Asians, I think sometimes we are harder on ourselves. And I don't know if that's a product of when another South Asian is targeted, we see that in ourselves and we don't want to acknowledge it. We don't want to acknowledge the fact that we could be next. And so we try to erect these barriers. I think sometimes it's easier to feel sympathy and empathy and allyship with other Black or brown people who are not South Asian, and we kind of don't prioritize advocating for our own community. And I think that if 9/11, Oak Creek, and the FedEx shootings have taught us anything, it's that we can't take that for granted. We can't take it for granted that anyone else will stand up for us. We have to stick together when it comes to advocating for the South Asian community as a whole, because many people view us all as interchangeable. Obviously, that's not true, but the only way we can bring down those stereotypes and perceptions is if we sort of band together and have one voice in solidarity and combat all of that bias, all of that bigotry, and all of those misperceptions that are out there about us.
Well, thanks to Sarita, Sriyanka, Kamal, and Amrit for this insightful discussion. Thank you for bringing us this film. You know, I think what we have to do as a legal community is, one, promote this film. So we will do that in the best of our ability, but that, to me, that information has to flow. Like, we can all recognize as a community that there's problems, but if we don't, you know, amplify it, then there's an issue. Thank you all for taking the time out to give SABA your time. You know, we appreciate it. And it was such a wonderful discussion today. And, you know, on behalf of the SABA North America advertising, media and entertainment committee or section, thank you so much for putting on this program. And we look forward to seeing more about this in the future. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.